Hello and welcome to Time Out for Trade. I'm your host, Macy Oplinski, and today we're diving back into duty drawback with Senior Trade Advisor Ann Jordanek. Ann, thanks so much for coming back.
No problem.
So, today's episode, we're going to start with where to begin if you want to file. So, how do you get started?
Okay. Well, first of all, there is an application process with U.S. Customs. Some companies, for example, in Canada, they don't understand this because in Canada, they do not require this. But U.S. Customs, I always tell people, you're asking for money back from the U.S. government. They don't make it easy. So they're going to make you jump through a bunch of hoops to kind of get things started. So with manufacturing, you have to file a ruling to get approved for your manufacturing process. And actually, part of that ruling, they also want to do tariff classification verification. So if you have binding rulings for your raw materials that are used in production, you definitely want to be able to provide those to be included in the ruling. Because the ruling process, the delay typically is with them having to send it to the lab to get classifications verified. So anyways, the ruling process kind of takes quite a bit of time. And if a company, which often is the case, they want to do manufacturing and unused, we kind of have to hold off on filing a special privilege application, which is the next step in the process, which involves 3 separate applications. There's unused merchandise applications to get what's called waiver of prior notice. Customs typically requires the opportunity to inspect the goods for unused merchandise before it leaves the country. But we file these applications, the waiver of prior notice, to avoid that inspection requirement. And there's 2 applications relating to waiver of prior notice. There's the retroactive one, which allows you to go back 5 years. As I mentioned, we have a period you can go back up to 5 years. And then there's also prospective in nature. It's waiver of prior notice for future exports. So you don't have to have any inspections done. Back in the old days, we used to have 3 inspections done, and then we could apply for waiver of prior notice. They don't have those requirements anymore. So we file those at the same time. We're filing concurrently. So you have both approvals at the same time. The third application for that is accelerated payment. That's everybody's favorite because that's required. It's not required, but it's part of manufacturing and unused merchandise. So with the accelerated payment approval, they can get their refunds back within about 30 days once they're approved by U.S. Customs. So it's kind of a lengthy process. The applications involve a lot of information, a lot of business records are involved in it, and it's time consuming, but we'll get you there. I always say drawback is very challenging, but it's doable. I do it all day long.
Can you get into a little bit of the restrictions when applying?
Sure. For drawback, and I think you're referring to the NAFTA and USMCA restrictions.
Correct.
There are restrictions on the methods that we can file drawback. So, for example, for unused merchandise, they require direct identification of the goods from export back to the original import entry that the duty was paid. And then for manufacturing, they have what's called lesser of 2 duties. There's a comparison there.
And what's the point of implementing these restrictions?
Well, the restrictions were initially implemented through Treasury against the drawback process. And it was really to make sure that foreign originating material is dutiable at least one time into North America. The unused, they just made it more challenging. For manufacturing, in a lot of cases, it's eliminated.
Can you go into a little bit about direct identification?
The direct identification requirements, typically you would want to identify the merchandise by like a serial number or lot number through the inventory process. But Customs does allow for inventory methods of identification. And the typical inventory methods, like you hear about for accounting, like FIFO and LIFO, first in, first out, last in, first out, require the tracing of all receipts into the system, as well as all withdrawals, which can include domestic sales. So a lot of times we don't use those inventory methods unless it's really a necessity. because of the amount of tracking. Most companies that are distributing here in the US, if they're shipping up like into Canada, for example, it's only 10%. So we don't want to track those other 90% sales. So we also, customs has some kind of hybrid methods. And a lot of times we use the low to high method of inventory identification. And it's usually done by an average inventory turn. And what we do is we designate the lowest duty per unit that's paid during the average inventory turn for the material that's exported and claimed at that time. And that allows us, with that inventory method, we don't have to track all withdrawals. We only have to track withdrawals for export purposes. The imports or the receipts, all receipts have to be identified, but only withdrawals for export purposes. And it really only works if they're not doing any dual sourcing, because if they have domestically sourced material that's going into their inventory, that's going to be the lowest duty that's paid during that process. So that's some of the questions that we have to ask when we're shipping. And again, these are for shipments that are going into Canada, Mexico, or Chile for that matter. In most cases, we can do substitution going overseas.
Right. How does the lesser of two duties work?
So the lesser of is a comparison of the duty that's paid on the raw material or components that are brought into the US and used in manufacturing against the duty that's paid in the destination country, like for example in Canada, on the finished good. And it's the lesser of those that you're allowed to apply for drawback due to these NAFTA and USMCA restrictions. But in most cases, if the goods are produced in the US and they qualify for USMCA, they go into Canada duty free. So that's eliminated a lot of manufacturing drawback here in the US for those exports that are going to Canada and Mexico.
Great. Thanks so much, Anne, for hopping on again and sharing your expertise on duty drawback. And I hope this information helps our audience navigate duty drawback a little bit better if you're thinking about applying. And don't miss our third and final episode with Anne as we answer all the FAQs when it comes to duty drawback. Thanks again, Anne, and we'll see you next time.
You're welcome.